Yo, hey, he made it. Just in time.
You had a good old-fashioned doubleheader. Is the series tied or is the Mets?
I know that was first bell. I do a journal question for you. The question is number 3 on your gray page. Okay, Jordan phone. How do you boil a frog? How do you boil?
Is this a joke?
Watch the board here all day. Watch the board.
Please tell me you're not wrong.
First of all, you got to catch a frog. First of all.
Yes, you're not wrong.
Bruh.
That was
I do too.
I wonder what they talk about it. Brother, it's something like that.
And
You're like that.
Will everyone please stand for the pledge of allegiance in a moment of silence?
Yes, baby.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please remain standing for a moment of silence. Everyone have a great day.
The question stands before you. How do you boil a
and
frog?
second of all, you gotta have boiling water.
It is a journal entry for you to write down. All these thoughts, Fatima, write it down. Write it down. Bryce, phone now. Thanks. Eric, greetings. Whose is this? Whose is this?
That's mine. I just can't reach it that much.
That's fine. All right. Well, you go download electricity. That is fine. You can't just hijack Bryce's spot though. How do you boil a frog?
Did you know that?
Vexing questions. Inquiring minds want to know. How do you boil a frog? We'll talk about yesterday's exam a little bit later. Okay, today we're going to paddle hard right on into what's next. But when I get a couple more students taking the test Joey just did, and it's not just this class, it's all my classes, that's when we'll take a look at it with the answer key. Jackson asking a question, of course I'm happy to answer all the side questions. You want to pull up the Chromebook and say, what about this question? Talk through it. That is certainly what I expect honors minds and inquiring minds to do. So, but just letting you know, scores overall very good, and I will announce our top scores at the end of our class as well. Question before you now, however, is how do you boil a frog? I got a lot of opinions right away. The team will make sure it gets on paper. That was scary. Do you have a new page of notes in front of you, Road to the Civil War. So have those out, keep those out, because that is where we're going today for sure. We have ended Unit 2A. We're diving into Unit 2B. And I'm just curious, how do you boil frog? So, it looks like we're still right. I'm going to have you tell your partner in a second. And then your partner is going to tell me what you said. So partners, you better listen up. You're not going to give me your answer. Bryce is going to give me Jackson's answer.
Is it just like boiled frog or like to eat the boiled frog?
How do you boil a frog? You write a recipe? And then you got some slap your mama season salt?
You can't, at least don't let it be bland.
At least, Swanson, if you're going to boil a frog, at least don't let it be bland. Like, what did you do? All right, tell your partner. Unless you got a shoulder partner, trios talk together. Tell your partner. I'm going to ask you what your partner said. So you better listen to what they have to say.
Heat it up with frog. How do you get that much in frog? You're like, you throw it in water, you cook it, you eat it.
So he doesn't really realize
That's not boiled.
All right, partner 2 should be chiming in. Trios making around in a circle.
Are we not saying?
I mean, I stop at like the history of boiling frogs. I'm not going to tell you what society said frog.
You don't wash, you don't
You take it out.
season it, you don't.
What was your?
Put hot water, please, wash the stuff, throw it away.
All right, Jackson, how is Bryce boiled frog?
Bryce had a very interesting way of thinking. He
Okay.
said that you turn the heat up slowly, so the frog doesn't know that it's boiling, and it adjusts the frog adjusts the temperature of its body.
That's not the coolest crap ever.
I like that answer.
Frog going out.
Jordan, what did Delaney say?
Take the mucus off of the skin, washes it, puts it in the water, and after 5 minutes,
Oh man, we got a full recipe here.
and you peel off the skin.
What seasoning we're dealing with?
Put on Cajun, garlic, onion, got all that.
Delaney took it next level, right? Delaney took it after the frog has been cooked, how we can actually consume said frog. I like it. Thanks for sharing. Madison, what did Fatima say? You catch the frog first.
Wait.
Frog has been caught.
No. And then you boil it.
Frog has been caught. And then you just like, you catch the frog and then it's like, shoom, you just boil it.
Yeah.
You kill it.
Now, Fatima has been concerned about catching the frog, so I'm gonna tell you, the frog has been caught.
That is
Frog
not
has
a
been
frog.
caught.
That is Dunkin'
You think I'm
Donuts.
sliding? You think I'm sliding?
That frog.
There's a lot of frogs.
All right.
She's on?
Catch the frog. Bryce, take me through your thought process. I'm sorry I started with Bryce because I really like what Bryce had to say. Bryce, Jackson already told me, but Bryce, take me through what you said again.
Turn up the water slowly in the heat so that their body adjusts to it. They don't know that.
What would happen if we just threw a frog into a boiling pot of water? It would jump out. You're right.
With the lid
So-
on, that's-
So, Bryce, Eric wanted to add with the lid on. That's important. I like that. I don't have a lid today. We'll see how this works out. Bryce is exactly right on the principle of how to boil a frog. And the principle is you must put the frog into room temperature water, normal water, right? Room temperature water, because the frog will tolerate that. And then slowly turn the heat up until it's cooked. Catch the frog,
I said kill
slowly turn the heat up, and then you season the frog, yes, right? Now, what we're going to talk about today is the road to the Civil War, and it is much like boiling a frog. You have to turn, in our country, what happened is we turned the heat up slowly, one event at a time, until we were cooked and war was inevitable. If we had started with a boiling hot pot of water, it would have been too hot, too spicy. The country would have turned away from the division. Whoa, those are radicals. But turning the heat up slowly, one event at a time, starting the division and the sectionalism in the country is what brought us to a civil war. So I have nervousness about this. We are going to try this, and because it's something you will never forget, to say the least. Delaney?
I will eat it in pieces.
Oh, you will not eat this tree frog that came from my house.
Yeah.
You will absolutely not.
Wait, they're alive?
Consume it.
Yes, they're alive.
Now, if I have nervousness about the hot plate here, and if we get to the point that
What haven't done that? Oh, stop.
You need help writing about that?
exactly what I was concerned about.
Oh my God.
I don't have a lid.
Don't need it.
I knew to make it. All right. You got time now. Right? You got time now.
Oh, we're
Gotta make it work. All right.
Yo, I don't do this.
You won't be boiling said frog, but I did get your attention. And what we're going to talk about today is the road to the Civil War. And I want you to remember, always practice at home, which I didn't. I want you to remember the idea of boiling a frog and how that led our country to the Civil War. So, got your attention. We will try to boil the water slowly. I'm not going to have a frog in it
Why
because
don't you just put like something on the top?
huh?
Like that big bin?
Yeah, a piece of paper is what we're going to go with.
Like that big wooden bin? You should have put it on
The
top.
big what?
Would be
Wouldn't be behind you.
Or the plastic that's hanging.
I just don't have a lid for the pot. Right? That's what I didn't bring today.
Doesn't mine does?
Hold on with the
That's where my
tongs in it.
wire would have.
Hold him with the tongs in it.
Y'all are doing it.
I did get your attention, which is what I was going for. I don't have perfect execution of the exercise here, but I want you to imagine a pot starting normal, and we are going to turn the heat up one event at a time until our country is boiling and the frog is cooked. So forgive my failed execution. We still have the illustration in front of us here. And what we need to talk about today is the road to the Civil War. So I want you to imagine a long and winding road. I want you to think about that slow process of boiling the frog. Yes, I brought frogs to the room. Just some failed execution. Maybe I can cut home and see if there's a benefit this pot. See who doesn't do the cooking at the house, right? Here's what we're going to talk about today. Couple things in review, right? I want you to remind me of the Missouri Compromise and the Second Great Awakening, abolitionism, right? These are things we should already be familiar with. In fact, tested you on it yesterday. Then we're going to talk about a couple of new things, a couple of different slave rebellions and their significance. What is sectionalism? A pretty important term, and it's just one we got to know. There's really not a synonym for it. I need you to know what is sectionalism. Compromise of 1850, we're compromising again. Haven't we already done this a couple of times before? Kansas and Nebraska, how do they fit in? Dred Scott, who is he and what's it mean? And then finally, the election of 1860. And if you're tracking years in your brain, if you know a couple of things about who fits into what era, you might know who gets elected in 1860 and why that matters to our country. That's right. So, and all of this is going to lead to, boom, war. No single event cooked our frog, but all of them together across time, even decades, leads to a roiling boil and a cooked frog in our country at war. So, road to the Civil War, let's walk it. Now, what you have in front of you are all the events in order, and it should not even, should not require you to do any jumping around today. We're going to walk down the front of the page, walk down the back of the page, and we're going to arrive at war about 30 minutes from now. So first of all, in review, tell me what was the Missouri Compromise? Jackson.
Missouri applied for statehood, and they want to be admitted as a slave state.
And the big problem with that is,
Big problem is it would set the balance, it would offset the balance of free states and slave states. So James Monroe also entered Maine as a state at the exact same time as a free state.
yeah, Jackson nailed it, right? I feel like we just did the 30-second review on this yesterday as well. What was the mnemonic I gave you? M&M. Because?
Missouri, Maine.
Missouri and Maine. Two states admitted at the exact same time, one to the north, one in Southern Territory, and that kept the balance. Went from 11 and 11 to 12 and 12. All things considered, the Senate and the House of Representatives maintained the balance, and it seemed like we had a solution for the time being. This happens inside the presidency of whom? Talk to me now. Yeah, James Monroe, a presidency of two lines. This is one of the lines. And the line actually established was 3630, right? We're getting real good at geography in this classroom as well. 3630, and we've already drawn the line on the map several times. This is definitely a review. As you're writing on your notes, you really should you should be able to do this without even needing to reference the screen, I would guess, because I would hope, because we've had this conversation several times already. This compromise negotiated by whom? Does anybody remember the name? Henry Clay, who is the great compromiser. I'm going to show you his picture today because I haven't done that yet, and I think that maybe you don't even remember who he is because he doesn't have a face to you. So I'm going to show you his picture here in just a couple slides. This is one of his several compromises negotiated as a member of Congress, as a leader of our country. Henry Clay is a very significant non-president. And that's why we keep saying his name over and over and over across many decades and many significant events. Missouri Compromise, here's another analogy for you, right? We talked about a line. It's kind of like slapping a Band-Aid on a big old bullet hole. And it is one of those events that's going to turn up the heat in our country. This is 1820. Following our brains here, you know we're walking towards 1860. 1820, we have several decades and key events that turn up the heat. This is one of them. In the words of the great American philosopher Taylor Swift, Band-Aids don't fix bullet holes. You say sorry just for show. If you live like that, you live with ghosts. It's just a Band-Aid on a bullet hole. This was delaying the inevitable. It was good enough for James Monroe. Got him out of his presidency. It was good enough for 1820. Got us to the 1830s. But it is not a solution. It is just a Band-Aid on a bullet hole. And maybe that's something that'll help you remember that right there. Second Great Awakening. We have already talked about this as well. So tell me the core ideas and major reform movements that come out of the Second Great Awakening. Delaney, give me a starting point. So we just rewind it to what is the core idea. You know, what starts this movement in the first place? Yeah, it's a religious movement of Christians. Second Great Awakening implies a first. We already had that conversation. This is another religious resurgence and revival throughout the country. Now, churchgoers, you may have a summertime revival, right? You're going to meet at church Wednesday or Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Woo! 4 nights in a row, we are revived. All right, that's what a church sometimes calls a revival. This was an era of revival, a long-lasting, history says 1790s all the way up to the Civil War, 1860s plus. So we're talking a 90-plus year era of revival, not just 4 extra church services that are going to get us back on track in the middle of the summer. Second Great Awakening. We've already had this conversation. Now, Delaney, what were you saying one of the big reforms was? Temperance, meaning no alcohol. Now, I'll tell you guys, we kind of learn to teach the class better as we go through the semesters, and we've already hit this. In the past, this was kind of the first time I was introducing it to classes, so I'm not going to peel it all the way back as we've already hit this and reviewed it and, quite frankly, even tested on it. This is the review. We're maybe stepping ourselves to these other events that really lead us to the brink of war. So temperance, no alcohol, right? Alcohol is bad. Dad drinks, hits mom, beats the kids. Alcohol is bad. Christians are going to say that we should do away with alcohol in our country. We want to have stronger families. Let's get rid of alcohol. I don't care what your opinion on alcohol is. I don't know what your family background with alcohol or alcoholism is. This is something that comes all the way from the Second Great Awakening. This movement towards temperance, meaning no drinking of alcohol. Women's suffrage. Well, I'll just lead us right into it. Who's the key leader? Susan B. Anthony. We're going to keep talking about her. And in fact, this movement itself won't be over. Suffrage meaning the right to vote. That part of the movement won't be over till 1919. So we're going to continue to talk about women fighting for the right to vote all the way into the 1900s. And then arguably, the fight for women's rights, equality in the workplace, etc., ongoing, right? That's kind of an ongoing movement. So suffrage meaning the right to vote, it gets its resurgence, it gets its start in the Second Great Awakening. And then the idea of public education and public education for all. What was the core principle of the public education movement?
Have educated people that can vote.
That's true. You want to add to it? Pretty much what Trinity said as well. Y'all chimed in at the same time. Yeah, we got to have an educated electorate for this democracy thing to work. I read an article just 2 days ago that basically said exactly that. Commentary on public schools, commentary on the state of the nation, saying how in the world, we don't have individuals educated enough in our democratic processes to be casting a vote for president. Now, of course, that's someone's opinion. But my point is, even in 2022, we're having this conversation about public education. Are our people educated enough to be casting a vote for president? So kind of interesting that we talk about it as history, and so many things that we talk about in a historical context are still very relevant today. And then the fourth one, and it's going to get its own screen today. The fourth movement was what? Abolition. Abolition is the idea of?
Abolish slavery.
That's right. Let's abolish slavery. Christians are leading the fight to abolish slavery. Slavery was abolished in England in the 1840s. In that regard, England was far ahead of our country in terms of answering or tackling the question of slavery, the question of human enslavement. American abolitionists are inspired by British abolitionists, and they actually take kind of a play out of the playbook. They see what happened in Britain. They see how to navigate the legislative process. They see how to inspire public support. England doesn't fight a war over it. Unfortunately, that's something that's only unique to our country. But these American abolitionists use a lot of the same tactics as the British abolitionists, just about 20 years later. So this abolition movement kind of modeled after the British abolition movement. Of course, it's a different part of the world. And slavery needs to be broken. The chain needs to be broken all throughout the world. So this is a little bit more in depth on abolition than we have talked about in the past. Who can be an abolitionist? Anyone. That's exactly right. He, she, he's and she's. What skin tone makes an abolitionist? It don't matter. Absolutely correct. So obviously you can have African Americans who are fighting on behalf of those in slavery. Some who escape slavery turn to advocacy or becomes outspoken abolitionists. Some born free see the condition of their fellow human and become abolitionists. And then certainly notable is white people who never engaged in slavery or maybe break free of the bonds of slavery and become abolitionists. So the big take is that anyone can be an abolitionist, and the same goes to where they're from. This is not a North or South thing. That's not to say all Northerners are abolitionists, all Southerners are slaveholders. There were Northerners who didn't care about the question of slavery. They didn't have slaves, perhaps, because it was illegal in their state. They weren't fighting for the abolition of slavery. There were Northerners who had that attitude. There are Southerners who are ardent abolitionists, don't own slaves, and are working behind enemy lines, you may say, to try to break the bonds of slavery. So to be an abolitionist, people of all types. And just a smattering here, we see Frederick Douglass. We'll talk about him a little bit more later. The second fellow there, that's William Lloyd Garrison. He was a publisher. He used writing, right? We talked about the difference between fighters and writers. He was a writer for abolition. In the middle, she is one of the two Grimke sisters. The Grimke sisters were known for speaking and writing. What do you think is significant about them? She's a she. Yeah, they are hers. They're women. And it's still at a time in a man's dominated world. They are outspoken abolitionists. They're recognized speakers and writers, even though being female, even though being women. So that's significant. The fourth picture across the board here, that's John Brown. And we're going to hang out with John Brown a lot here in just a second. So I won't elaborate on him. And then the fifth one, the far right-hand side, that's Harriet Beecher Stowe. She is also a significant writer. She writes a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, and we're going to talk about her in depth a little bit later this week as well. I like this quad, or what was it, 5-quint? I like this 5 picture here because it shows the variety of abolitionists. And just to make the screen even busier, I'm not going to say every name there, but you can see the variety of people who are abolitionists. It's not one type, it's not one gender, it's not one geography. Abolition is a movement that is nationwide and needs to gain, seeks to gain foothold all across the country. What are we saying here? What are you noticing? Susan B. Anthony is also an abolitionist. Yeah, that's right. This has both Grimke sisters. Salmon P. Chase ran for president. John Quincy Adams, former president. Like I said, I'm not going to say every name up there. Goes to show you that you can meet all types of people were for abolition, not just one type of person.
John Quincy Adams.
John Quincy Adams, the former president, so I'm not going to go too in depth, but he fights on behalf of securing freedom for African Americans before he dies. He actually dies on the House of Representatives floor, fighting for a bill that would essentially abolish slavery. Well before his time, right? Some of these people didn't live to see the abolition of slavery. Some of them never saw their fight realized. John Quincy Adams is one of those. So good.
Well, why didn't he do it during his presidency?
Great question. That's a great question. Fatima asked a big question, and I'll give it a 10-second answer, and then we'll take for a possible bathroom break. We've got to consider the context that each of these people lived in. Remember, Thomas Jefferson said, "Holding slavery is like holding a wolf by the ears. If you release it, it might destroy us." And he's a slave owner, right? Mixed legacy when it comes to that. A lot of these early founding fathers genuinely believed it would die out in its own time. 1 or 2 generations from now, this won't even be a conversation. He never envisioned a civil war that would cost 500,000 lives, and that really is kind of the whole setup to the fact that we have to fight the Civil War. So I see Fatima shaking her head. I like that. We sit here in 2022, and we can question some of the actions of these men. Were they aggressive enough in standing for what they believed in? Were they a product of their times? What would I have done differently? These are big historical questions. Can't exclusively answer because we are not time travelers. But good thought. Good notice on John Quincy Adams there. All right, let's go to the restroom. I'm gonna wash my hands with some soap.
Do get on the.
Trae un post que dice Jackie.
You didn't think I really had a frog.
I was just so surprised.
A little bit better before I jump into it. Jackie!
Yeah. Right here.
Oh, it's TK. All right. All right, fam. Now we're here's some new information. Right, we elaborated on abolitionists a little bit. Fatima, you inspired me to research John Quincy Adams. I want to make sure I said all of that right. But I do know he had abolition in his legislation later in life. Great question, though. Why didn't these guys do things when they had literally all the power in the country? Why didn't he take action at that time? So great thought there. Let's talk about some new stuff. A couple of slave rebellions. We're going to talk about two. One being called Nat Turner's Rebellion, and then the other will be John Brown and his raid, very notable slave rebellion. So slave rebellions began to occur, and this gave, who do you think that this brought a whole lot of concern to?
Owners, slaves.
Slave owners, yeah. So slaves, one, using their voice, banding together, especially getting their hands on weapons, gave them the ability to maybe rebel against their white overlords. There were generally more African Americans on a plantation than white owners. So, numbers, they had the potential to start a rebellion and maybe even win on a small scale, right? So the slave rebellions we look at, we see that they might have the first strike, might have one little tiny victory, but in the grand scheme of things, the strength of the federal government, which we've seen put down several rebellions already, will be used to put down a couple of these different slave rebellions. And then in the after effects, what do you think is the condition of the slaves and the slave population afterwards? Decrease what? Say it again.
I said they were decreased, and so that did rebel probably not.
Definitely the second part. So numbers decreased, slavery continued, but the condition of their slavery increased in harshness. That's kind of what I thought. That's where Trinity was going, right? It increased in their harshness. So that's something that we see come from these slave rebellions. First one, Nat Turner's Rebellion. Now look at the year, 1831. This is one turn on our griddle. Okay, we're turning up the heat just a little bit more. Nat Turner was an enslaved man, but he was a preacher to his area, right? To his plantation, maybe even neighboring farms. He was known as a preacher, and he believed that it was his mission on earth, given to him by God, to set his people free. He almost had this Moses-like attitude, right? Let my people go, set my people free. He gets this idea from one night. He has a dream, and in his dream, he sees the stars all line up, and whatever that meant to him kind of gave him the mission that this is God telling me I'm supposed to free my people through armed rebellion. Now, the dichotomy there, and the trade-off there is, whoa, a preacher is going to take up arms? Doesn't he believe in peace? Isn't he worried about murder? Got to take it from a soldier's perspective. I can speak to that. From a soldier's perspective, if you're in an armed conflict, you don't see your enemy as something. You don't see enemy deaths as a murder. You see it as a part of the war. So I can understand how you can be a Christian, him being a preacher, and still want to take up arms in what you see as a justified fight. He leads a slave rebellion. They have some small victories. They actually they have fights on 4 different Virginia plantations. So Virginia is notable in this regard as well, because it is a southern state. It is a plantation economy for sure, but it is on the northern side of those southern states, almost a middle colony or what will become known as border states. So the fact that this was in Virginia, a little bit closer to the north than, say, Virginia and Alabama, or Georgia and Alabama, that's significant. In the end, about 60 whites were killed before Turner and his accomplices were captured. They were tried and they were executed for what they did. So Nat Turner, he was 31 years old. Place that in context. That is a hair younger than I am right now. You guys are always wondering about my age. There's a little hint for you. 31 years old. So he was young. He was fit. He was capable of inspiring people to follow him, and that's exactly what he did. This is one early slave rebellion that kind of has lasting consequences. So, as we kind of already said, what comes from this is a fear of the African Americans banding together, becoming a mob. White settlers, white farmers began to fear for their women and for their children. And here's what I would say is a negative, certainly a negative repercussion, not something Nat Turner would have anticipated. And in the long run, it's kind of very negative towards the condition of slavery. At this time, in the 1830s, Virginia was on the edge of considering legislation that would have outlawed slavery. 1830, we got the Missouri Compromise, the attitude in the nation goes, flexes both directions. Virginia might have been one of the first southern states to take on the question through legislation. Well, following Nat Turner's rebellion, what do you think Virginia's attitude became?
You wanna attack us? We'll just follow it.
The opposite, right? Eric says the quote, holding the wolves by the ear. Delaney said, hey, you're going to attack us. Of course, we're not going to free you now. Virginia actually kind of cranks down on its slavery laws. And you see the harshness of enslavement. If you can even imagine the harshness increasing, you see the harshness kind of increase for those who are enslaved. And there are some lasting consequences. Those consequences are this. From this slave rebellion, in this era of Nat Turner's rebellion, slaves can no longer be taught to read. Since he was a preacher, slaves are now no longer to hold church services and be preachers. Slaves can no longer carry a gun, hunt, or own livestock. Like carry a gun, why were they letting them have guns? A lot of times a duty of a particular slave, I don't want to say duty like he had to do it, but a slave would go out and hunt for a family. So of course that requires carrying a firearm. Well, in light of this, now we're not going to let slaves carry guns anymore because they might use those guns on us. So some notable things that come out of Nat Turner's rebellion, and here we have the frog one more time. We're turning up the heat on our griddle, and we're boiling the frog. It's getting just a little bit warmer. He's getting cozy in that hot water, though. Right? You guys are like, no, he jumped right out. He's getting cozy in that hot water, and he's getting towards cooked. So that's Nat Turner's rebellion. You see on your notes there, John Brown's raid. Sequentially, that comes several years later, so just hang on to that one. I'm going to hit John Brown in a second, and we're going to move on to your next block, which is sectionalism. Now look at the word itself. Break the word apart. What does it say? Section. All right, so sectionalism, the sections of the country. What does the word by itself imply to you?
Like different parts.
Say it again.
Different parts.
Yeah, different parts of something, and in this case, what is sectioned off? Different parts of the country. That's right, regions. Now, it's real easy to think about North and South, but let's not forget the West, right? We're actually in a grand competition for persuading the West. Both sides are trying to persuade the West to join their side. Northerners want Western territories to become free territory, free states. Southerners want Western territories to become slave territories, slave states. And of course, you can see we talked about President James K. Polk and what he wanted out west. He wanted to gain land in order for it to be used, as slave land. So what I'm saying in this is there's really three sections. Of course, we're going to focus on North and South. When we talk about fighting the war, we generally say it's the North versus the South, the Union versus the Confederates. But let's not neglect the West as well. And then the big idea here is that each section wanted to do what's best for it. War of 1812, national unity, yay for us. I am an American. Well, we've seen that crack and crumble over these next couple of decades. And now we have that kind of selfish attitude, right? What's best for the North? What's best for the South? Division in Congress, division in the rhetoric, division in the votes. So sections. Each section is trying to be superior than the other. There are four main sectional differences, and this is I can kind of put it into a mnemonic so you can help you remember it, and that is PEGs. Differences in politics, a difference in the economy, difference in the geography, and then a difference in the slavery question. Politically speaking, it's generally Democrats in the South, and when we say Democrats, we mean the party of Andrew Jackson, and quite frankly, it's the party of Democrats that is still the Democrat Party to this day. Obviously, a current Democrat wouldn't say that slavery is a proud part of our legacy, but it is the same Democrat Party, right? They haven't morphed since then. Democrats generally in the South, and then up north we got several parties kind of on the rise, and we're going to see a rise in what will become the modern day Republican Party. So, generally speaking, not just like today, you can't say that this is an all Republican city and that's an all Democrat city. But generally speaking, it was Republican politics to the north, Democrat politics to the south. The economy, a lot of times we say the north was industrial and the south was agrarian. That's accurate to say, right? There was industry up north. There was also agriculture up north. And a lot of times we say that, oh, well, slavery persisted in the South because they were an agricultural economy. They needed the slaves to work the plantations. Northerners had crops to grow. They just had to pay their help, right? And guess what? They proved that you can pay the help and still turn a profit. It's called hiring someone and having an employee. So Southerners hang on to this, we needed slavery for our economy. The Northerners figured out how to grow crops without slaves. So there is an economic difference between the industry and agriculture, but I don't want to neglect the fact that there are crops up north as well. Geography, that's pretty obvious one. I mean, one is situated to the north and one to the south. And then the slavery question. So pegs is kind of a way that you can think about the sections. Sectionalism is a big idea, a super important one. Kind of take it back to our first unit. We had mercantilism. We had to hit on several times. One of those systems that if you don't understand the system to begin with, you're going to struggle to understand the impact of it. So sectionalism we'll continue to talk about and hear about as well. And there it is. You can kind of see what is north, what is south, and then the great west, right? What is out west? And we're going to talk about how some of those western territories become states here in just a second as well. So a big question is, how did we get so sectioned or divided? Like, what would you say? The story of us so far, we've talked about a lot of things. How did we arrive at this point of being so sectioned? Take a couple heads nodding, huh? Slavery, right? The advent of slavery in the first place. When those first slaves stepped off the ships in Virginia in 1619, we started something that we kind of could never put back into the bottle.
Like maybe everybody had like two different beliefs, so they just picked a side and they were just separate.
Pick a side sounds a whole lot like what?
36, 30.
That's a point that led to like a literal line that kind of establishes sections, huh?
American Revolution.
The American Revolution. What? What about it?
Loyalists or patriots.
Okay, so we haven't always had people on the same page, right? We said, so many of our movies show patriots all the way, but yeah, there was divide even back then as well. What about? I want to pick on. Jackie said divides. What would George Washington have called those? And he advised to avoid this part. Yeah, political parties or factions. So the advent of political parties is part of the advent of this divide as well. What was our original government? Not the Constitution. What was our original form of government? Articles of Confederation. Confederation is a collection of independent unions. Use the wrong word. Confederation is a collection of those who have their own interests, not a union. So the very nature of our first government kind of says that I'm looking out for me. Yeah, I'm in this collective, but I'm definitely looking out for me. So from the very beginning, the Articles of Confederation kind of contributes to our division. Different interests or specialties per region, which kind of lends to the word sectionalism. Political parties and factions, a big one. Jackie, good job there. And then the idea of states' rights. And we've already had it rear its ugly head through nullification, the nullification crisis. That was managed at the time, but it was another one of those Band-Aids on a bullet hole. So we're going to see states' rights be an issue going forward as well. And then finally, the slavery question. So it is, most easy to say which states had slavery, which states didn't. The agriculture blends from state to state. Attitudes of patriotism versus sectional. Slavery is the big question, right? Slavery is definitely what's going to lead us to war in the first place. All right, well, let's get in. It's going to turn up the heat on our frog all the more. Let's erase let's go ahead and erase the Missouri Compromise. All that work we did, Henry Clay did to negotiate a compromise at the time of Missouri and Maine. Let's rip that Band-Aid off. We're going to have what is known as the Compromise of 1850, which essentially erases the Missouri Compromise. So moving on to the back page here. I know it's a lot today. We're layering a lot of stories together, but we're going to get to the end, and I think you're going to see one big, pretty picture, and it's walked us all the way to war with our water boiling. Compromise of 1850 basically does away with the Missouri Compromise. why the heck have this original, we draw this line and we say north be free, south will be slave. This is how we're going to negotiate things into the future. Why would we need to erase the Missouri Compromise? Because what? That's exactly right. Yeah, the Missouri Compromise did not apply to territories we didn't have yet. We have a whole new bunch of territory. Some might say, well, just extend the line, right? Just keep the line going. But others are going to say, no, that wasn't part of the original compromise. So the issue is going to need to be renegotiated. Who steps in? None other than Henry Clay himself, the great compromiser. There he is. Jackson, you're giggling. What are you giggling at?
They erased his original compromise. Previous compromise.
Jackson, I thought you were giggling at the hair. I thought you were giggling at a physical attribute, but you're exactly right. They erased his original compromise, so he gets brought in to renegotiate another one. Yeah. So here we are again. This is the same guy who created the American system. He negotiated that so-called corrupt bargain that put John Quincy Adams into power and made him the Secretary of State, and he negotiated the Missouri Compromise. So here he comes again. He's going to be responsible for what is known as the Compromise of 1850, long legacy of being a compromiser. Although really, I left Jackson's giggles because it kind of reveals the issue here. He's renegotiating his own compromises in the first place. Here's the Missouri Compromise. Here's what it actually did. It was an argument over slavery, North and South, as new territories out west wanted to be added to the country. So specifically, we're going to have to deal with California and Oregon being added to the country. And 5 things, go ahead and write this down. It's related to California and Oregon. And 5 things are going to be negotiated along the way that's going to establish, just like 3630 was supposed to be how we dealt with the problem. This is now going to establish what we'll do into the future as well. And you are going to see that it's going to be kind of a democratic process that we'll arrive at. And of course, that's not, when we're voting on slavery, that's not always a good thing. You can say you write that down.
We have a meeting today for SAU.
That is right after this.
Today's Thursday?
Today's Thursday. It's just the 3rd day of the week, though, so I feel a little bit off as well.
I don't see the effective date on this.
All right, here's the 5 things. So 1 and 2 are kind of combo, and you're going to see a bunch of our present-day states start to get into the game here. Utah and New Mexico will enter as states, and they get to choose whether it's free or slave. So the people of that territory, which is about to become a state, they will get to choose whether Utah and New Mexico are a free state or a slave state. So majority rules in that regard. Doesn't matter their geographical location in terms of north or south as it relates to 3630. 3630 is gone. Now they get to choose whether to be a free slave state or a slave state. At the same time, California enters as a free state. That is what its people already negotiated for. So that's action 1, 2, and 3. Number 4, this is going to affect the whole country. And this is going to be a big win for the Southerners in that regard. All people in the United States will have to work to return runaway slaves to their original owners. This is called the Fugitive Slave Act. It is connected to the Compromise of 1850. So there's no longer a free area in the country that a slave can escape to. Technically, based on the compromise, now are there families that would harbor them? There is what we know as the Underground Railroad. If they make it to Canada, the states don't have jurisdiction at that point. Many of them escape to the Bahamas as well. That's that same direction.
Is this when they would like house slaves? I know it was called
Underground Railroad? Does that ring a bell?
I don't remember it.
Yeah, you're saying the right thing, Jackie. People would harbor slaves along the way and help them get to freedom. But the problem with the Fugitive Slave Act is you can't just make it to a free state. You can't just go to Massachusetts, a northern free state, and now be free forever. Oh, I'm on free soil. I have made it. No, because the Fugitive Slave Act, if you're a fugitive, what are you? What are you running from? Yeah, you're a criminal. You're running from the law. Well, now bounty hunters can pursue that person, runaway slave, all the way into a free state and bring them back to a slave state. people in those free states are technically obligated to return slaves to their original owner. And of course, there are people that are going to, so that's going to make lawbreakers out of good people. You got a bunch of Christian abolitionists who are trying to do away with slavery. If they harbor a slave, they are now a criminal because they're violating the Fugitive Slave Act. So Northerners really didn't, and abolitionists really didn't appreciate that fourth point right there because they didn't want to be held to enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act. So it was part of the compromise that made California a free state, but a lot of people don't like that fourth point right there. And then finally, as a trade-off, there will be no new slaves in the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C. Not a state at that time. It's not a state to this day. Slavery can continue, but the slave trade is outlawed in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is situated right on the border of free and slave territories. So it's kind of the northern edge of what is slave territory. This is the Compromise of 1850. And it's just another Band-Aid, right? 1820 was Missouri. 1850 is now negotiated by Henry Clay. And you know that we're walking towards 1860. So it really is just another Band-Aid getting us there.
What if, let's say, a woman runs away, right?
Okay.
And she gives birth in a free state. What would happen then?
I don't know the exact answer. I would think that the original owner could lay claim to that child, although the counter could be it was born on unfree soil. So that's a great question. We don't have a court case that I'm aware of that really deals with that, but we're going to deal with something slightly similar. It's not about a baby being born, but we are going to deal with something slightly similar. And the Supreme Court is going to speak on it, kind of giving an authoritative answer. So I don't know how we deal with childbirth. Great question, but we are going to deal with something pretty similar. I'll get to that here in just a second. That's a great thought, great critical thinking. One more Band-Aid. This time it's out west more or less, and the heat is turned up one more time. I love this picture of Henry Clay. Now that I've showed you a picture of him, you kind of understand a little bit better. And he says, ugh, I can't keep doing this forever. There's a line. I drew a line one time, but man, out west, how's that red line look out west?
Not looking.
Yeah, it's not a clean line. It's not just a line of latitude, question mark on all the puzzle pieces. It is just a Band-Aid on a bullet hole one more time. So poor Henry Clay, his legacy is that of compromiser, but none of his compromises had a real lasting power, staying power. And, you know, to this day, his compromises didn't accomplish much other than leading us to war. So just kind of a descriptive political cartoon there. All right, we walked ourselves now to 1854, and we got the so-called Kansas-Nebraska Act. So that's dealing with two states that are the heart of our country, the heart of our country today. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is a vote in Congress that said Kansas and Nebraska can decide whether it'll be slave or free. It basically repealed both the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850. Right? This is one more erasing of Henry Clay's dealings, and the new policy is going to be that any new territory can decide whether it be slave or free by voting. Democracy rules. You might say that's a pretty American principle, but what it's going to lead to is a lot of violence, and that's going to lead to this area being known as Bleeding Kansas. And the reason it gets called Bleeding Kansas is because of what happens inside of Kansas. Pro-slavery people cross the board since people get to vote. Think about this. Since people get to vote, and we just come through an election where there's some allegations of fraud, this, that, and the other, right? And we're dealing with 2020 technology, computers, ballot counting, literally satellites get involved, right? The ballots were counted through the through Wi-Fi, this, that, and the other. Today, if we can't secure election today, do you think that they had the ability to 100% secure election in 1854? Lots of potential fraud. You think that dead people can vote today, right? Sometimes dead people get a ballot, and that means that they cast their vote from the grave, and obviously that's not possible. Well, imagine these days where you could sign up for a ballot in one county, walk on over, say that you're a resident of that county, sign up for another ballot, vote. Lots of potential fraud in these elections. What was happening in Kansas at this time, as this election, like to decide the fate of Kansas, are we a free state or are we a slave state? people would cross the border from Missouri into Kansas, and they were pro-slavery people. They were called border ruffians. If you're a ruffian, you're kind of rough and tumble. Border ruffians would cross into Kansas. They would, one, cause fights with abolitionists in Kansas, and that led to a lot of bleeding. That's why it's Bleeding Kansas. But two, they would cast their vote falsely, right, erroneously, would cast a vote for slavery in Kansas. So that's fraud on a whole bunch of levels. They're crossing into Kansas, casting their vote, causing trouble along the way. Abolitionists in Kansas are known as Jayhawkers, and that is where the University of Kansas to this day is called the Jayhawks. So it's not about a bird. It's actually the legacy of being an abolitionist in Kansas. Violent abolitionists, right? A lot of Christians are peaceful people. No, these were violent abolitionists who were fighting on behalf of what they believed in, and that led to clashes. Border ruffians, Jayhawkers, lots of clashes in Kansas. This is called Bleeding Kansas.
If the state got to choose whether or not it admitted as a free state or slave state, how did it repeal the Compromise Act?
So the Compromise of 1850 basically didn't deal with, it's a fair question, Jackson. It only dealt with these territories right here. So now Congress has made a sweeping statement going forward. It wasn't Henry Clay's original 5-point Compromise of 1850. This is now the new reality going forward. All future territories are based on voting. So no more, you get to vote, you're admitted free, fugitive slave, you're like, this, now it's all voting. And so one, great point. One, these are the territories we're dealing with, and these are not the present day points, right? That's way bigger than Kansas is today. That's way bigger than Nebraska is today. You can even look at Minnesota. That's way bigger than Minnesota is today. That's because we're still negotiating what will become present day borders. So when we're saying that they're voting for that territory, it's a pretty large swath of land. And, you know, I'm not going to get into how individual borders were negotiated on, like, you know, into the future. That's a pretty big vote. That's going to affect a lot of people in a lot of acres. Jackson, what you're getting to, what you kind of brought up, is that as of 1854, the slavery status of every new state was going to be determined by popular sovereignty. And this is on, it's dropped right below Kansas, Nebraska. That is its own block because it's that important of a word. Popular sovereignty basically means voting. It literally means rule by the people. So I'll give you this one right here. Popular sovereignty means rule by the people, i.e. majority wins. Just like if I said, hey, we're going to have a treat day on Friday, you want ice cream or pizza? And we take a vote in this classroom, the majority would win. Well, now the slavery question is going to be determined by vote, popular sovereignty, rule of the people, majority wins in terms of determining the slave versus free status of every new state in the Union. And to Jackson's point there, this is just now the guiding principle all throughout the country. No more compromising, no more this state gets that and the other state gets to vote. Now the new ruling, as voted on by Congress from the Kansas-Nebraska Act, is that all the slavery question for all states will be determined by popular sovereignty. Important term because it's going to continue, you know, into the present day. We do a lot of voting where the people can cast their ballot on or cast their vote on a particular state question. That is essentially an example of popular sovereignty, rule by the people, majority wins. So in this case, of course, they're dealing with the fates of individuals and the entire institution of slavery. Take a breath. Sounds pretty good. Got the heat turned up though. Kind of wish I had a roiling boil on my pot there with cooked frog, but I think the analogy persists. All right, Fatima, this is what you just brought up. So we're going to talk about the Dred Scott case. A lot of times, so it's technically called Sanford v. Scott. And in your government class next year, you're going to talk about some specific Supreme Court cases. The way that a Supreme Court case is always referenced is this person versus that person. In this case, it's called Sanford v. Scott. Sanford is the slave owner, and Scott is the slave. But the simple naming of a lot of times this is simply known as the Dred Scott case because the man at the center of it is Dred Scott. Dred Scott is a slave. He is a slave who traveled with his owner, and that's Sanford, to various free states. In fact, he spent time living in both Illinois and Minnesota. Free territories, free states. He's lived in a free state. Now, if he's from a southern state, he was born into servitude, born into slavery, But as he's traveled with his owner, he's existed in free territories. And he argues, he actually sues for his freedom. He argues that since he lived in free states, he should not have to return to a slave state with his owner. His owner was trying to go back to Missouri where they were from. And Dred Scott says, I live in Minnesota. I'm in a free state. I'm not returning to Missouri with you. Now, so you know how court cases work. You start at a low level and appeal to another level. And finally, this case made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And just cut to the chase here, the Supreme Court rules against Dred Scott. They say that the Supreme Court says that slaves are property, not people. They say that the language used in the case is that enslaved individuals are not citizens. So basically denied the citizenship of an enslaved African American. And that makes them property, not people. And that means that owners can move them around the country at will. Think about this. Jackson, if you're going to go from Georgia to Minnesota in your vehicle, is that vehicle still yours in Alabama and Tennessee and Illinois and whatever highways you take to get all the way to Minnesota? Is that vehicle still yours?
Yes.
Yeah, that vehicle is still yours in every new state. It's pretty much what the Supreme Court said about Dred Scott. He is property no matter what state his owner takes him to. He's not a citizen. So that's going to lead to the idea that we have to establish citizenship for African Americans in the future. We're going to get to a constitutional amendment that grants them citizenship, but we're not there yet. Really a super negative Supreme Court ruling. Fellow on the left right there, that is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. His name is Roger B. Taney. And this ruling is seen as one of the grandest failures in judicial decision-making in history. The Dred Scott case is definitely the low point for the Supreme Court, and it is definitely one of those turning up the heat one more time, leading us to civil war. Enrages the North, empowers the South. The year is 1857. So we're walking ourselves towards 1860, the election of 1860. And we find ourselves right now at 1857. So doing good. I'm gonna round it out with a video here in just a second. I got two more things to add to you. All right, we're gonna talk through. So what I want you to do right now is cut back to John Brown. John Brown's raid is essentially a slave rebellion. So that's why I have it right there under slave rebellions, right under Nat Turner. What you can summarize this in your own language, okay? I got a lot of words on the screen, but just hear me out for a second, then you can summarize it in your own words. John Brown kind of has a two-part story, and the first part of the story happens in 1856. John Brown is in Kansas. John Brown is a ardent abolitionist, a violent abolitionist, if you will. He believes, similarly to Nat Turner, that he's been directed by God, commanded by God, part of his personal faith, to lead a slave rebellion. So amidst this bleeding Kansas, amidst a lot of violence going on in Kansas, John Brown and his sons raid a Kansas plantation where a white family owns black slaves. And what they do is they kill 5 people. They drag these slave owners out of their beds in the middle of the night on a mission from God. They essentially execute them in the streets. And because of the condition of Kansas at this time, they aren't held accountable in any way. Right? These days, you'd have the law tracking you down, and it'd be a big deal till you're caught and brought to justice. But in these days, John Brown, he was elevated by some, right? He's a hero to some. Of course, he's a criminal to others. What he does is he takes his reputation, again, revered by some, hated by others. He leaves Kansas, and what he wants to do is he wants to go to Virginia and start a slave rebellion, start a slave war. So this is John Brown circa 1854. Looking at this picture here, what kind of a person do you see? Arrogant? Is it its arms crossed? Yeah. What other features stand out to you? It's the smile for you?
Yeah.
What about the smile? Come to you. What about the smile?
I don't know.
It's like a smirk.
A little bit of a smirk? Yeah. So interestingly, we're at photography, finally, right? We're at photography. Early photography had to stand still for a very long time. So the fact that he kept even a small smirk, he would have had to hold that smile for a very long time. That's why you see a lot of plain-faced pictures because people had to stand still for so long. So I like the observation about the smirk there. Sometimes your facial features are really telling. Delaney, Trinity, what'd you say? Well groomed, well kept. Yeah, I noticed that as well. He seems to be. He's a dad. He's a leader of his family. You can just see him holding his Bible and going into church on Sunday. He looks pretty well kept. Well, let's advance John Brown to his time in Virginia, and what do you see now?
Oh,
What's notably different?
he got fat.
Fat. That's what you jumped to? Yeah, the beard for sure. Who's he kind of look like?
Abraham Lincoln.
Kind of looks like. Oh man, I thought you were gonna say Abraham the Hebrew. He has this new Abraham Moses attitude, right? Let my people go, just like we said with Nat Turner. You gotta have kind of biblical understanding here. Moses led the Hebrew slaves to freedom. Well, John Brown sees himself on a mission to lead African Americans to freedom. So what he does, he leaves Kansas. He intends to start a slave war, and what he's gonna do is attack a federal munitions armory, a place where they stored a lot of guns and ammunition. And adjusted for today's value, he attacks a place that has $7 million worth of guns. So this is not like robbing the pawn shop. This is not getting your hands on a couple of pistols. He takes over what is known as the Harper's Ferry Armory, and it houses over $7 million worth of guns and ammunition. But the problem with his plan is that he's going to rely on local African Americans to rise up and join his fight. He needs to raise a slave. Like, who else is going to carry these guns out of here, right? He's relying on local African Americans to catch word of what's going on. Hey, there's a man fighting for freedom. He's at the armory right now. Let's leave our farms and go help him out. And that's exactly what doesn't happen. Not that maybe they didn't want to, but that they just did not respond or they weren't able to come and help him out at the armory. So here we go, 1859, right? I've walked 1856 is the first time we talk about him. Here we are, 1859. John Brown leads a group of mixed race men, okay, white abolitionists, some black men who joined his army. They raid the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is present-day West Virginia. That's going to be a part of the future, is that West Virginia is going to remain free, and Virginia is going to be what is the slave state. His goal was to arm slaves for a rebellion, but like I said, they didn't necessarily respond. He did not raise the army that he expected to raise. At Harper's Ferry, Virginia, the United States Marines are called in to respond. Leading those Marines, and I mean, they're called Marines, and they're basically in the army. Leading those Marines was none other than Colonel Robert E. Lee himself. How are we going to hear about Robert E. Lee in the future? Yeah, he's going to be the chief general of the Confederate Army. So look at the year, 1859. We're on the edge of war. We have Colonel Robert E. Lee of the United States Army leading soldiers in capturing John Brown at Harper's Ferry. Think of the two pictures that you saw previously, like well kept. I like what Trinity said. He grows the beard, his eyes, kind of icy in the eyes. Now, this is not a photograph, but a portrait. What do you think this portrait is saying about John Brown? Yeah, so the crazy really comes out in this portrait. He's larger than the rest, so Jackson, he's acting with the power of God. What else? With a Bible in one hand and a rifle in the other, what's he doing? He's stomping on dead people. Now, this is representative of the whole conflict. You see the American flag, you see the rebel flag. This is a painting, not a photograph. But this is really representative of how significant John Brown was to starting the conflict. You talk about turning up the heat. John Brown and his raid really turned up the heat that's going to lead to the two states fighting, or the two sides fighting against each other. So the real tipping point in the war before the election of Abraham Lincoln is John Brown's raid. Now let's see how it ends. So he is captured. He is put on trial. He's convicted for, what do you think he'd be convicted for? Murder, we might put murder up there, kidnapping, but he's convicted for treason against the state of Virginia, right? Ironically, not the United States, but the state of Virginia. Convicted for treason and put on trial, and he is executed. I'm gonna blow this picture up real quick. This picture is called The Last Moments of John Brown. So contrast this now to the wild-eyed picture we just saw. What do we see here now? He's not holding the baby, but he's hugging the baby, right? Kind of kissing the baby. What kind of a baby?
Black baby.
Yeah, black baby, African American baby. So let me open the door.
I thought you had a key. Sorry. No, you're fine.
Miss Dial is covering your
Cool.
advisement today.
Cool.
So she
I was
can
just gonna
hear
peace
about
out.
Joanna. Yeah, just make sure you take attendance before you leave, and
Maybe.
then,
I'll click save.
cool.
Do we have advisory today?
Apparently, that's what the word on the street is. Yeah, and I've got some crazy meeting, something about fellowship.
I'm gonna shut the door on her now. Shut the door on her now. I ask her every Tuesday and Thursday to get advisory play. Portrait here, Pat casts a very different picture, right? Shows him as grandfatherly, shows him as caring for a child. Very different than that picture right there. And in the last moments of John Brown, it is said that he meets his fate with a total acceptance. He goes to the gallows, he is hung, and really powerful phrase here, author Ralph Waldo Emerson, and I'm not going to get into the ELA stuff, but he writes a lot of famous stuff otherwise as well. He says of Brown that the gallows were as glorious as the cross. What connection is he making there?
With Jesus.
Yeah. He's saying that John Brown died for others as Jesus died for salvation of the world. And of course, it wasn't a rugged cross, but it was the gallows and the rope, which is a method of execution at the time. And Ralph Waldo Emerson says that the gallows were as glorious as the cross. So that speaks to the significance of how John Brown was viewed as an abolitionist. Now, Northerner at first, he was kind of met with a horror reaction, North and South. A lot of people are like, wow, crazy guy raiding the arsenal, But eventually, many Northerners came to respect him. Many Northerners made him into a martyr. What is a martyr? Someone who's killed for what?
What they believe in.
Yeah, for a cause. Yeah, so for what they believe in. So he's made into a martyr by many Northerners. How do you think Southerners approached him? Viewed him?
They like
Disgrace. I like that word. What did we say about Sons of Liberty? Yeah, terrorist. A lot of Southerners were angered by his actions, and then reasonably we could say that they viewed him as a terrorist because of how he behaved. Three super interesting facts about the raid about John Brown's raid. One, Harriet Tubman was supposed to be at the raid with John Brown, but she was ill at the time of the raid, and she missed the raid, and that likely saved her life. Everyone who's involved with John Brown on this day was either killed in the fighting or executed thereafter. So Harriet Tubman was supposed to be there, but she wasn't, and that likely saved her life. We know that she goes on to do many other things. Two, John Brown planned this raid with Frederick Douglass. African-American abolitionist, escaped slave, has a vested interest in helping other slaves escape, and very interesting that he connects with John Brown's story. He's not at the raid either, and of course he goes on to do significant things because of that. And then finally, a connection. This being a very politicized situation, very like a lot of eyes on it, a lot of attention being given to it. There was concerns over the security of the jail and the gallows, the execution site. So a lot of Southerners were afraid that Northerners would come in and try to rescue John Brown. So what they did was they sent their state militia, which was known as the Virginia State Militia, and also known as the Richmond Grays. In those days, if you weren't a part of the U.S. Army, you kind of had your local militia. They're known as the Richmond Grays. They come from Richmond. Who was with the Richmond Grays on the day that John Brown was executed? None other than John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth going to go on to do. Kill Abraham Lincoln. So John Wilkes Booth was at the execution of John Brown. John Wilkes Booth was an ardent sectionalist, a rabid pro-slavery believer. And it is said that when he saw John Brown hang, he whet his appetite for violence. He whet his desire to, kill more people. And of course, he doesn't kill anyone else until the president. Actually, he doesn't kill anyone until the president. But John Wilkes Booth kind of got his taste, his bloodlust at the execution of John Brown. Also there was Thomas Jackson, future Stonewall Jackson. and Robert E. Lee, of course, as well. So a lot of future key players in the Civil War are present at the execution of John Brown. All right, super fast. Let's go get through the election of 1860. So the bottom line, write these words down. Abraham Lincoln is elected president. In a very divided election, Abraham Lincoln is elected president. He is basically he wins because he's the favored candidate in the North. And bottom line is the North just had more people. He's literally not even on the ballot in several southern states. Not even being on the ballot, he still wins the election. He wins with a very small percentage, 39% of the vote, which is the second lowest popular vote getter next to John Quincy Adams, who actually wins the race. So far from a majority wins. A majority rules half of the candidate. He does not get 50% of the vote. He does not get a majority of the country. He gets a scant 39% of the vote, but he is the he gains the most votes and he carries the Electoral College. He's elected president. A lot of southern states, even before the election, stated if Abraham Lincoln is elected president, we are not going to be a part of this country anymore. They're basically threatening secession even before Lincoln became president because they believed he was going to abolish slavery from the get-go. That's actually a bit of a false understanding of what Abraham Lincoln was. Abraham Lincoln, now, don't hear me wrong, Abraham Lincoln was not an abolitionist. Abraham Lincoln was opposed to the expansion of slavery, but Abraham Lincoln was a unionist. Abraham Lincoln wanted to keep the Union together. And in his personal writing, now we know he's the great emancipator. We know him as the great emancipator. We know he does free slaves through the Emancipation Proclamation. But as elected, Abraham Lincoln was not an outright abolitionist. He was a unionist. He wanted to keep the Union together. He has a very famous quote, and I'll read it here. He says, so you want to get into his writings and see what he actually believed. I know I'm probably turning it upside down for some of y'all. You're like, you don't want to free the slaves? Hear me on this. He did free the slaves. But as elected, he prioritized keeping the country together. Here's his quote. He says, if freeing all of the slaves would have saved the Union, I would have done it. If freeing none of the slaves would have saved the Union, I would have done it. If freeing some of the slaves would have saved the Union, I would have done it. He valued saving the Union no matter what the solution to slavery was in the outset. Now, still, many southern states saw his election as kind of the death knell of the Union. They're like, Lincoln's elected, I'm out. Delaney?
He didn't live long enough to fully.
You're right. You're exactly right. He doesn't see that vision realized at all. He is taken from the earth before he ever sees the true abolition
John Wilkes Booth.
of slavery. That's right, by John Wilkes Booth himself. This is Lincoln on the campaign trail. And at this famous campaign debate, he's not even the elected president yet. At this debate, he says this famous quote, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." What he's trying to say is we can't be part slave and part free. But he recognized that a house divided will not stand. So for those who wondered his position on slavery, this statement really speaks to the idea that he realized we had to be all one or all the other. He was not in favor of the expansion of slavery. So lead it back to he was in favor of the abolition of slavery. But initially his position, I don't want to twist the legacy of Lincoln here for you. Initially his position was to keep the Union together, and it became the freeing of slaves. In the final bit of his statement there, it'll become all one thing or all the other. And it was the election of 1860 that brought our country to that roiling boil. This would be the point of the demonstration where I would pick a frog out of our, but you know what we didn't do today? Set off the fire alarm. Set off the fire alarm. I don't worry about the frog. You know what we did do today was set off the fire alarm, so I'm going to call it a win. I told Jackson when I had the bathroom break, I was kind of envisioning building a lesson that would really grab your attention, and I hope I did that nonetheless. And I was thinking that, you know what, they might not remember everything about the Civil War when they're 40, but by gosh, they're going to remember that Joker boiled a frog. So even though we didn't boil a frog, maybe you'll still remember the analogy. All right, last bit on your notes there. Think about this. Here's the big summary. Issues that divided the nation. Sectionalism, culture, the difference between North, South, and West, economy, the difference between North, South, and West, and politics. Sectionalism, culture, economy, politics, Boom leads us to war. The frog is cooked. I feel like I'm missing one. I feel like I'm missing one.
Slavery.
Slavery. Right, let's not miss slavery. Now, we got just enough time to do this, so hang with me. This is a very powerful video that says it far better than I ever could. It poses the question, what actually caused the Civil War? And in 6 short minutes, I think we're going to learn something. We're going to see a unique perspective, but a true perspective. A unique perspective, but a true perspective on what caused the Civil War. So let's just round out class with this. Here we go.
A question that is on every car buyer's mind is, what way?
Was the American Civil War fought because of slavery? More than 150 years later, this remains a controversial question. Why? Because many people don't want to believe that the citizens of the southern states were willing to fight and die to preserve a morally repugnant institution. There has to be another reason, we are told. Well, there isn't. The evidence is clear and overwhelming. Slavery was, by a wide margin, the single most important cause of the Civil War for both sides. Before the presidential election of 1860, a South Carolina newspaper warned that the issue before the country was the extinction of slavery, and called on all who were not prepared to surrender the institution to act. Shortly after Abraham Lincoln's victory, they did. The secession documents of every southern state made clear, crystal clear, that they were leaving the Union in order to protect their peculiar institution of slavery, a phrase that at the time meant the thing special to them. The vote to secede was 169-0 in South Carolina, 166-7 in Texas, 84-15 in Mississippi. In no southern state was the vote closed. Alexander Stephens of Georgia, the Confederacy's vice president, clearly articulated the views of the South in March 1861. Our new government, he said, was founded on slavery. Its foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, submission to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. Yet despite the evidence, many continue to argue that other factors superseded slavery as the cause of the Civil War. Some argue that the South only wanted to protect states' rights. But this raises an obvious question. The states' rights to what? Wasn't it to maintain and spread slavery? Moreover, states' rights was not an exclusive Southern issue. All the states, North and South, sought to protect their rights. Sometimes they petitioned the federal government. Sometimes they quarreled with each other. In fact, Mississippians complained that New York had too strong a concept of states' rights because it would not allow Delta planters to bring their slaves to Manhattan. The South was preoccupied with states' rights because it was preoccupied first and foremost with retaining slavery. Some argue that the cause of the war was economic. The North was industrial and the South agrarian. And so the two lived in such economically different societies that they could no longer stay together. Not true. In the middle of the 19th century, both North and South were agrarian societies. In fact, the North produced far more food crops than did the South. But Northern farmers had to pay their farmhands, who were free to come and go as they pleased, while Southern plantation owners exploited slaves over whom they had total control. And it wasn't just plantation owners who supported slavery. The slave society was embraced by all classes in the South. The rich had multiple motivations for wanting to maintain slavery, but so did the poor, non-slaveholding whites. The peculiar institution ensured that they did not fall to the bottom rung of the social ladder. That's why another argument that the Civil War couldn't have been about slavery because so few people owned slaves has little merit. Finally, many have argued that President Abraham Lincoln fought the war to keep the Union together, not to end slavery. That was true at the outset of the war, but he did so with the clear knowledge that keeping the Union together meant either spreading slavery to all the states, an unacceptable solution, or vanquishing it altogether. In a famous campaign speech in 1858, Lincoln said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." What was it that divided the country? It was slavery and only slavery. He continued, "I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. It will become all one thing or all the other." Lincoln's view never changed, and as the war progressed, the moral component, ending slavery, became more and more fixed in his mind. His Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 turned that into law. Slavery is the great shame of America's history. No one denies that. But it's to America's everlasting credit that it fought the most devastating war in its history in order to abolish slavery. As a soldier, I am proud that the United States Army, my army, defeated the Confederates. In its finest hour, soldiers wearing this blue uniform, almost 200,000 of them former slaves themselves, destroyed chattel slavery, freed 4 million men, women, and children from human bondage, and saved the United States of America. I'm Colonel Ty Sidgley, professor and head, Department of History at the United States Military Academy, West Point, for Prager University.
Close it out here. A lot of people talk about regional pride. A lot of people talk about states' rights. A lot of people elevate Robert E. Lee, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, godlike status. Rebel flag. It's Southern pride thing. Let's not forget the war was about slavery. The peculiar institution unique to us, and we have the right to secede over it. The war is about slavery. All right, so let's keep that in mind. I know we live in Georgia, and I know that's maybe breaking some years of a mental model in your growing up perspective. Civil War is about slavery, and those fighting against the American forces were rebels, not another country trying to express its rights. Rebels from the Union, intent on preserving human bondage and slavery. So we'll talk more about some big issues. We're never going to shy away from them. We have walked ourselves to the Civil War, and the pot is boiling, but we still have a school, so that's cool as well. Hey, thanks for listening all the way to the end. I hope you learned something that you didn't know when you woke up today. You are going to